Well, hello everybody, and I'm very happy to be here. This talk is called Dawn of the Hyperobjects, and my title is supposed to be somewhere between Dawn of the Dinosaurs and Dawn of the Dead, possibly with a little bit of Dawn of the Age of Aquarius thrown in. I'm not exactly sure where that is, but perhaps we'll find out as we'll proceed. Tectonic plates, global warming, nuclear radiation, evolution. These are hyperobjects, entities that are massively distributed in time and space, at least relative to human scales. Hyperobjects appear in the human world as a product of our thinking through the ecological crisis we've entered. The ecological crisis is best thought as the time of hyperobjects. Why? Because this is the moment at which massive non-human, non-sentient entities make decisive contact with humans, ending various human concepts such as world, horizon, nature, and even environment. Art, in the time of hyperobjects, isn't simply art about hyperobjects, but art that strives to evoke hyperobjectivity in its very form. I'll try to explore some of this art in my talk. In particular, I'll show how what we thought of as postmodern art is often better thought as the first stirrings of a truly ecological art, and why irony hasn't gone anywhere in the time of hyperobjects. In fact, it's even more poignant than ever. Hyperobjects are viscous, molten, non-local, phased, and interobjective. Let's go through these properties one by one. 1. Viscosity. The more we know about them, the more we find that we are glued to them. We find ourselves unable to achieve epistemological escape velocity from their ontological density, just as we were beginning to enjoy our ironic free play. No fair! 2. Molten temporality. Salvador Dali's paintings of melting clocks, corny as it is, rather elegantly depicts how any massive object distorts space-time. Many hyperobjects really are massive enough to do this for real, with visible effects, as in the case of planet Earth itself, so time runs faster on a plane than on Earth's surface. But all objects melt and ripple time like this. There is no such thing as a rigid body extended in time and space for this reason. And for every object there is a radically unknowable space and time, because the speed of light sets limits on what objects can apprehend. Hyperobjects end the idea of absolute infinite time and space as neutral containers. 3. Non-locality. Hyperobjects can't be localized, and local phenomena such as rain become what Levi Bryant calls a local manifestation of these non-local objects. Thus, hyperobjects play a mean trick. They invert what is real and what is only appearance. Thus, the wet stuff falling on my head is less real than the global warming of which it's a manifestation. This is not cool, as they say. 4. Phasing. Hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space. This is why they are partly invisible to us 3D humans. They seem to come and go like seasons, yet really they continue to unfold elsewhere than we look. 5. Interobjectivity. Hyperobjects are shared by numerous entities in a common sensual space. This shared space is a vast, non-local configuration space that I call the mesh. More on this in a moment. Phenomena such as human subjectivity, intersubjective phenomena that is, occupy small regions of the space of interobjectivity. We should dwell on this last one a bit because perhaps it's the most interesting for thinking about art. Every interobjective phenomenon requires 1 plus n real objects. This means that for every interobjective system, at least one real object is withdrawn. For example, consider a beat. A beat occurs when one tone is cancelled by another tone. You make a beat by cutting a continuous tone. The gap between the two is a beat. Now, every event in reality is a kind of inscription in which one object leaves its footprint in another one. Interobjective reality is just the sum total of all these footprints crisscrossing everywhere. It's non-local by definition and temporally molten. The print of a dinosaur's foot in the mud is seen as a foot-shaped hole in a rock by humans 65 million years later. There is some sensuous connection then between the dinosaur, the rock, and the human, despite their vastly differing timescales. Now, when we return to in our mind's eye to the time of the dinosaur herself, we discover something very strange. All we find there is another region of interobjective space in which impressions of the dinosaur are transmitted. Tooth marks in some hapless prey, the frozen stare of the dinosaur as she looks at her next victim, the smooth scaly feel of her skin, more dinosaur prints even when the dinosaur is alive. Even the dinosaur doesn't know herself entirely, only in a rough translation that samples and edits her being. A mosquito or an asteroid has their own unique sample of dinosaur-ness, and these samples are not dinosaurs. Why? Because there is a real dinosaur, withdrawn from access, even from herself. Black holes are right here in magazines and on the web as JPEGs and GWiz pop science essays and sci-fi movies, yet they are not here, evidently. But even if you could somehow climb into one with a video camera, you couldn't know the whole story about black holes. Why? Because your video of a black hole is not a black hole, because black holes are real. Now here's a very fresh example of a hyperobject, an ancient bamboo forest on Chilai Mountain in central Taiwan. What you're going to watch and hear is the wind in the bamboo. What you're going to watch and hear are the bamboo stems clicking one another. What you're going to watch and hear is a QuickTime movie which samples visual images and sound at a certain rate, translating them into a more or less perforated version of themselves. What you're going to watch and hear is my hand moving slightly as the muscles in my right forearm fail to maintain stillness. What you're going to watch are photons from the sun reflecting from quanta in the chloroplasts that make the bamboo green. What you're watching are chloroplasts, bacteria hiding from the environmental cataclysm they created, the cataclysm called oxygen, 1.5 billion years ago. The sum total of all the sampling events by which an object inscribes itself on other objects is a history, in both senses of that wonderfully ambivalent Greek term, since history can mean events and recording. Hyperobjects have a history of their own, not simply insofar as they interact with humans. This history is strictly the time of hyperobjects. Raindrops splatter on the ground in Western California. They record the history of El Niño, a massive weather system in the Pacific. In particular, they record how the Japanese tsunami scooped up some of El Niño and dumped it on trees and hills and other objects in the object called the USA. El Niño itself is the footprint of a hyperobject called global warming. Another footprint may well have been the Japanese earthquake itself, since the changing oceanic temperature may have changed the pressure on the Earth's crust, resulting in an earthquake. The quake destroyed 4 nuclear reactors. Quanta from these reactors, known as alpha, beta, and gamma particles, inscribe themselves in soft tissue around the world. We are living textbooks on global warming and nuclear materials, crisscrossed with interobjective calligraphy. This is the historical moment at which hyperobjects become visible by humans. This visibility changes everything. We humans enter a new age of sincerity, which contains an intrinsic irony that is beyond the aestheticized, slightly plastic irony of the postmodern age. What do I mean? This is a momentous historical era at which humans achieve what has sometimes been called ecological awareness. Ecological awareness is a detailed and increasing sense, in science and outside of it, of the innumerable interrelationships among life forms and between life and non-life. Now, this awareness has some very strange properties. First of all, the awareness ends the idea that we are living in an environment. This is totally weird. This is so weird that we should dwell on it a little. What it means is that the more we know about the interconnection, the more it becomes impossible to posit some kind of entity existing beyond or behind the interrelated beings. When we look at the environment, what we find are discrete life forms, non-life, and their relationships, but no matter how hard we look, we won't find a container in which they all fit. In particular, we won't find an umbrella that unifies them, such as world, environment, ecosystem, or even, astonishingly, Earth. What we discover instead is an open-ended mesh that consists of grass, iron ore, popsicles, sunlight, the galaxy Sagittarius, and mushroom spores. Earth exists, no doubt, but not as some special enormous bowl that contains all the ecological objects. Earth is one object coexisting with mice, sugar, elephants, and Turin. Of course, there are many scenarios in which if Earth ceased to exist, Turin and mice would be in trouble, But if the mice were shot into space aboard a friendly extraterrestrial freighter, Earth wouldn't be the cause of their death. Even Turin might be rebuilt brick by brick on some other world. By mesh, I mean something disturbingly entangled, without center or edge, so finely interwoven that everything is caught in it. I also mean something that appears to us, since mesh stems from the word mask. A mesh is a screen of finely interwoven links. Is there anything behind it? Suddenly we discover the second astonishing thing. Mice are surely mice, no matter what we call them, but mice remain mice as long as they survive to pass on their genome. It's what neo-Darwinism calls satisficing. Satisficing is a performative standard for existing, and there is no mouse-flavored DNA. There isn't even any DNA-flavored DNA. It's a palimpsest of mutations, viral code insertions, and so on. There isn't even any life-flavored life. DNA requires ribosomes, and ribosomes require DNA. So to break the vicious cycle, there must have been an RNA world of RNA attached to a non-organic replicator, such as a silicate crystal. So there is a mouse. This is not a nominalist, nor is it an idealist argument, certainly not. But the mouse is a non-mouse, or what I call a strange stranger. Even more weirdly, this is why the mouse is real. The fact that wherever we look we can't find a mouse is the very reason why it exists. Now we can say this about everything in the universe, but one of the most obvious things we can say this about is a hyperobject. This is because hyperobjects are so huge and so long-lasting compared with humans that they obviously seem both vivid and highly unreal for exactly the same reasons. Hyperobjects such as global warming and nuclear radiation surround us, not some abstract entity such as nature or environment or world. Our reality has become more real in the sense of more vivid and intense, and yet it has also become less knowable as some one-sided, facile thing. Again, for exactly the same reasons. In Berkeley, California, radiation levels in water a couple of months ago spiked 181 times higher than normal because of the Sendai reactor meltdowns. We know this. We know that we are bathed in alpha, beta, and gamma rays emanating from the dust particles that now span the globe. These particles coexist with us. They aren't part of some enormous bowl called nature. They are beings like us, strange strangers. Should we stop drinking water? Should we stop drinking cow's milk because cows eat grass, which drinks rainwater? The more we know, the harder it is to make a one-sided decision about anything. As we enter the time of hyperobjects, nature disappears and all the modern certainties that seem to accompany it. What remains is a vastly more complex situation that is uncanny and intimate at the same time. There is no exit from this situation. Thus the time of hyperobjects is a time of sincerity, that is, a time in which it's impossible to achieve a final distance towards the world, but for this very reason it's also a time of irony. We realize after we discover hyperobjects that non-human entities exist that are incomparably vaster and more powerful than us, and that our reality is caught in them. What things are and how they seem and how we know them is full of gaps, yet vividly real. Real entities contain time and space, exhibiting non-local effects and other interobjective phenomena, writing us into their histories. Astonishingly then, the mesh of interconnection is secondary to the strange stranger. The mesh is an emergent property of the things that coexist and not the other way around. For the modernist mind, accustomed to systems and structures, this is an astounding, shocking discovery. The more maps we make, the more real things tear through them. Non-human entities emerge through our mapping, then they destroy them. Thus the time of hyperobjects is an art that does the art of the time of hyperobjects is an art that explores the uncanniness of beings, the uniqueness of beings, the irony of interrelationships between beings, and the ironic secondariness of the intermeshing between beings. The art that explores the hyperobject appears spontaneously within contemporary art because of non-humans. Human artists did nothing to make them appear. Of course there is art that thematizes global warming and so on, but even this art is a function of the sudden appearance of hyperobjects in front of the human structural tendency, like those 3D images of cups, of flowers, that appear in front of a magic eye picture. But again, just like those very pictures, it turns out that the non-humans were there all along, staring us in the face. Because in a magic eye picture, the cup or flower is distributed throughout the mesh of fuzzy little patches of the image. The object is already there. Before we look at it, global warming is not a function of our measuring devices, yet because it's distributed across the biosphere and beyond, it's very hard to see as a unique entity, and yet, there it is, raining on us, burning down on us, quaking the earth, spawning gigantic hurricanes. So in some deeply rigorous sense, Hyperobjects and objects in general infested human art forever. All that has happened is that humans have dropped something, a concept that their art is by them, for them, about them. Non-humans are responsible for the next great moment in art history. The human mist evaporates, leaving behind what is real, entities, objects, strange strangers, without a totalizing context, without a world, without nature, all because of ecological awareness. What does this mean? This art by, for, and about non-humans, art that includes non-humans for sure, but in a far wider configuration space. It's almost like a return to the Platonic notion of art as demonic inspiration, like a regression from the last 2,000 years of Western art history. The end of progress, but in another way we could read the evaporation of the human mist as a step beyond the story of art so beautifully told by Hegel. In this story, art has three phases, which makes art in the time of hyperobjects the fourth phase. Phase 1, symbolic art. Now here's Hegel's view, is that art develops according to the interplay between what we know and what objects are, precisely those objects that constitute art. Art materials. The interplay, then, is a dance between humans and non-humans. It's true that Hegel's history does have its many quirks and charms, not the least being an insufferable imperialist sense of manifest destiny in which Western art and religion play the central role. However, since it is precisely against Western fantasies of mastery and exception that hyperobjects exert their overwhelming powers, among other things such as Pacific Islands flooded by global warming, it seems appropriate to trace Hegel's narrative, especially since we're going to kick it away in the end, or rather since hyperobjects do. Phase 1 of the dance between non-humans and humans is when humans see the non-humans as overwhelming them in another sense, argues Hegel, not because they understand them, but because they don't. Non-humans seem to possess godlike powers. Stones speak. The heavens shape human destiny. Symbolic art is Hegel's term for art in this phase. This kind of art shows how objects tower above human comprehension and mastery. So even early Christian art, such as a Gothic cathedral, is awe-inspiringly huge and terrifyingly magnificent, such that human worship just bows down before it. This is not just the age of indigenous fetishism, so-called, but also the European Dark Ages. Phase 2, classical art. There then comes a sweet spot in which human comprehension is just enough to understand some of the true inner nature of objects, but not everything. In this sweet spot, a harmony emerges that a later age could only regard as an illusion. Humans and non-humans meet each other halfway, generating all kinds of beautiful machinery. This is why Haydn or Mozart sound so sweet, argues Hegel. The non-human no longer towers over the human, but the human doesn't fully comprehend the depths of its own inner space. We shall find this phase is stunningly short-lived compared with phases 1 and 3. Phase 3, romantic art. Now, Hegel being Hegel is telling this story from the standpoint of the human comprehension of the absolute. I'm ignoring the absolute for reasons I think should be clear. I'm a realist, not an idealist. Yet I think that the one-way street quality of Hegel's story is important. It's hard to unknow what you know. As a matter of fact, it's downright impossible. So this is a story about evolving human understanding, though it's not a progression in my view. It doesn't have a telos or endpoint. For Hegel, the story does indeed have an endpoint. This would be the Romantic period, Hegel's own. In this period, humans recognize the infinite depths of their inner space for the first time. It becomes radically impossible to embody this inner space in any non-human entity, so romantic art must talk about the stunning failure to embody the inner space in outer things. Yet by failing this way, art ironically succeeds to talk about the inner space. Isn't the inner space precisely what can't be embodied? So the job of art is to fail beautifully, or rather sublimely. A truly Christian art is now possible because art can now express the ironic gap between the divine idea and fallen human flesh, embodied in the incarnation of Christ. So oddly medieval cathedrals are less Christian than a Beethoven string quartet. The story of this failure is recorded in the history of the avant-garde, which is also bound up with the history of the failure to change the objective social conditions of capitalism. The long march of the isms is the march of one form of romanticism after another. At the same time, art realizes that philosophy is now its big brother. At the very least, art needs manifestos and statements of purpose, philosophical exploration and justification because of its failure. The more we know more than we can embody, and we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So the default position of Romanticism, which I believe has been going on from about 1776 to about last week, is a kind of irony. Irony being the aesthetic exploitation of gaps, or gapsploitation to be short. My class and I came up with this term because we were fed up with the technical definition, my definition, which is the exploitation, the aesthetic exploitation of a gap between 1 plus n levels of signification. I know this is a big mouthful, but it's terribly important to hold it in mind, because irony means that more than one thing is in the vicinity. Irony is the echo of a mysterious presence. For there to be irony, something must already be there. We can perhaps see this phenomenon, in this phenomenon of irony, stemming from an awareness of 1 plus n levels, the seeds of Romanticism's dissolution, but perhaps this knowledge is only available to us now in the time of hyperobjects. Remember the discussion of interobjectivity. Remember how hyperobjects point out how things share a weird kind of central space in which everything is entangled. When you encounter a phenomenon in this central space, 1 plus n entities are withdrawn in order for this encounter to take place. What does this say about the central space of art, humans, and non-humans? Well, as phase 3 continues, art becomes increasingly abstract and increasingly strident. First, human inner space subjectivity is liberated from sensuous appearance. Then this inner space is encapsulated as the inner spaces of characters in realist fiction. Then the realist narrator collapses, and we readers are led to encounter more nakedly the mysterious human inner space in naturalism. Then interior monologues develop, and narrative almost collapses into drama. At the very same time, something is happening to non-humans such as poems, books, and prose, paint, and stone. In 1790, it was possible to see prose as a special kind of poetry with very long lines, lines that have to be right justified and called paragraphs. But by 1900, that magic date again, poetry had become a little island of consistency in a giant ocean of prose, and now it's even possible to see prose narrative as a part of an even larger configuration space of games and gaming, fully including the human in the object, the move from reader as passive spectator to reader as participant, observer, naturalism, to player. Monet had started painting water lilies, or rather he had started to paint the space in which water lilies float, or rather he had started to paint the rippling, reflective object in which the lilies float, the water. Just as Einstein discovered a rippling, flowing space-time where previously objects had just floated in a void, Monet discovers the sensuous spaciousness of the canvas itself, just as later Tarkovsky was to discover the sensuous material of film stock. All this had been prefigured in the Romantic period with the development of blank verse narratives, meandering through autobiographical detours. Suddenly, a whole lot more paper was involved. Proust took this discovery to its wonderful logical conclusion. Jackson Pollock took it to another conclusion. Paint and brushes and drips started to set themselves free from the inner space whose representation they were supposed to be, in some ironic, half-veiled way. Huge resonant sound waves began to escape from the composer's dreams into the performance space and beyond on radio signals and in MP3s. Yves Klein blue, a colour whose chemical components killed their inventor, spread itself across canvases with the help of naked human bodies. It's hard to discern exactly when it happened, though with 2020 hindsight and some insights into the ontological priority of objects, we can begin to see it everywhere. Non-humans stopped speaking about the human failure to access them. The evanescent mist that Hegel identified as the modern human state of style of subjectivity just evaporated, leaving objects behind like crystals in a solution. All of a sudden, it was the time of hyperobjects, phase 4. Ecological. This time is very like phase 1. Objects now exceed the human again, but with the lack of a reverse gear. This is not because we have suddenly stopped knowing things. We have a phase 3 sense of irony. Human knowing is stratospheric, yet object withdrawal from access, including the object we call ourselves, is abyssal at one and the same time. Irony now means not that we have achieved escape velocity from Earth, but that we haven't. Irony now means that we are glued to objects, like Anansi glued to the tar baby. The more he tries to pull free, the more glued he becomes. It turns out that there is a time after the end of the world, after the conclusion of the film noir of human history, in which we figured out that we are the criminals, a time in which we have entered the uncanny valley, and in which we realize that the valley has no outside. As more and more entities slip into the valley with us, as we come to know them better, the more we find ourselves coexisting with strange strangers. This is what ecological awareness means, not some nice hippie utopia or healthy paradise, but a charnel ground, a bardo, a valley between illusory peaks. In robotics and CGI design, the uncanny valley is a set of appearances of robots and CGI figures that is strange and horrifying for humans. The less like a human the robot seems, the more acceptable it is. Doesn't this explain certain features of racism? Hitler loved his dog Blondie, but spent his time exterminating humans whom he dehumanized, reducing them to lower than dogs. Now, the map of the uncanny valley suggests that beyond the zombie trough, there are healthy persons. The valley slopes back up again. In other words, the uncanny valley diagram itself is racist. Who gets to decide when the slope starts to ascend again? I suggest that by contrast, all entities, humans included, begin to slip into what at first appears to be a valley, but actually turns out to be a very different reality altogether. The other point against the upward slope is that a robot version of your mum is uncanny not because it apes a healthy human, but because your mum is already a robot. Chief among these entities would be hyperobjects with which we're intimate. The water content of the atmosphere has gone up 5% since 1960. Not much, but enough to make the weather very uncanny. And global warming is an object on whose inside we find ourselves, like in the story of Jonah and the whale. Vast cosmological hyperobjects, such as black holes, are so distant and exotic, and so instantly fatal to anything like a life form. Close to them you or I would cease to exist. And they are shielded from Earth by a glass-like screen of the atmosphere. Jane Taylor's poem The Star is all about the atmosphere, in which stars are not cold and dead, as in outer space, but twinkle, twinkle. Now, when the atmosphere ceases to be a glass-like screen and starts to threaten us, it's as if the glass in front of a painting in an art gallery has started to attack us with radiation, shooting out beams of ultraviolet onto our sensitive skin. Our experience becomes one of disgust and pain, default modes of the aesthetic that art normally displaces. So art about hyperobjects must trade in this disgust and pain. It's here that I must mention Jay Lyatt's work. Jay Lyatt is a composer who makes sonic hyperobjects. On Jay Lyatt's webpage there are some found art pieces, some of which are recordings of hydrogen bomb tests in the Pacific. To hear this cataclysmic sound, without the minimal protection of the distance afforded by a small movie image of an exploding bomb, an image for which no sound is given, as if the event has taken place too far away to hear, well, devastating is one word for the experience of hearing the bomb. I'm still too frightened to play it to you, having tried to listen to the Bravo test on headphones a few weeks ago in the dark of night. Pieces like this force us to get a close look at gigantic objects whose shadow looms into our world everywhere. In so doing, they tell us about what the universe is made of. The universe is made of objects. What are they? Let's think about them a little more. In the following sections, I'm going to explore the emerging philosophical movement called object-oriented ontology, which I think arrived on the scene just in time for the ecological emergency. Objects are what constitute reality. Objects are unique. Objects can't be reduced to smaller objects or dissolved upwards into larger ones. Objects are withdrawn from one another and from themselves. Objects are TARDIS-like, larger on the inside than they are on the outside. Objects are uncanny. Objects comprise an untotalizable, non-whole, not-all set that defies holism and reductionism. There is thus no top object that gives objects value and meaning, and no bottom object to which they can be reduced. If there is no top object and no bottom object, it means that what we have is a very strange situation in which there are more parts than there are wholes. This is what Levi Bryant calls the strange mereology of objects. Objects are like Doctor Who's TARDIS, bigger on the inside than they are on the outside. This makes holism of any kind impossible. This really means what it says, folks, so now we'll get on to explore how, even if you bracket off a vast amount of reality, you will find that there is no top and bottom object in the small section you've demarcated. Yes, that's right. Even if you select only a sector of reality to study, like they do in ecological science, the mesocosm, you will also find no top or bottom object, even as pertains to that sector alone. There are not even quasi-top and quasi-bottom objects then. It's a bit like a magnet. If you cut it, the two halves still have a north and a south pole. There's no such thing as half a magnet versus a whole one. So why is holism such a bad idea? Surely there could be other possible holisms that adopt some version of both-and thinking so that neither the parts nor the whole, whatever the whole might be, are greater. Perhaps the parts are not necessarily lesser than the whole, but exist in some both-and synergistic fashion. You could have simultaneously withdrawn objects and something else just to satisfy the modern need for things that aren't static, let's say an open-ended, perhaps always expanding something else. First, some semi-related points about this line of questioning. It sounds like good value to have both and, rather than either or, to our somewhat consumerist mind, buy one, get one free, but I'm afraid this is a case of either or, holism or not. As for the open-ended something else, for object-oriented ontology, this is just another object. Or it doesn't exist as an appearance, or it doesn't exist except as an appearance for another object. Let me explain. But first, in another sense, the part-whole model object-oriented ontology deals with is indeed a kind of both-and. This is the sense in which the parts are not replaceable components of the whole. The more we open up the Russian doll of an object, the more objects we find inside. Far more than the first object in the series, because all the relations between the objects and within them also count as objects. It's what Lacanians call a not-all set. Objects in this sense are fundamentally not subject to phallogocentric rule. Yay! Commercial break. If you're having trouble with the word object at this point, why not try another term such as entity? What we're dealing with in object-oriented ontology is a Badiou-like set theory in which any number of affiliations between objects can be drawn. Strictly, the contents of these sorts of set are bigger than the container. This affects a political theory of objects, as I hope to show. I often find children's books come to the rescue for explaining objects, so meet A House is a House for Me. The title couldn't be better for my argument. The text is a wonderfully jumbly plethora of objects, otherwise known as a Latour litany. Cartons are houses for crackers. Castles are houses for kings. The more that I think about houses, the more things are houses for things. In this story, a dizzying array of objects is presented. They can act as homes for other objects, and of course, in turn, these homes can find themselves on the inside of other homes. Home, then, is purely sensual. It has to do with how an object finds itself inevitably on the inside of some other object. A house is the way one object experiences the object on whose interior it finds itself. So then these sorts of things are also houses. A mirror is a house for reflections. A throat is a house for a hum. A book is a house for a story. A rose is a house for a smell. My head is a house for a secret I never will tell. A flower's at home in a garden. A donkey's at home in a stall. Each creature that's known has a house of its own, and the earth is a house for us all. The time of hyperobjects is the time in which we discover ourselves on the inside of some big objects, bigger than us, that is. Earth, global warming, evolution, and so on. That's what the eco in ecology originally means. Oikos, house. The last two lines of A House is a House for Me makes this very clear. Now, the ruse of this story seems to be that to display its effortless brio, a lot of silly, fun houses are presented in the penultimate section as we hurry towards the conclusion, which then sets the record straight by talking about a real house, the Earth. But I shall argue that this is not the case. Object-oriented ontology doesn't claim that any object is more real than any other, but it does discount some objects, which it calls sensual objects, or at least my version and Graham Harman's do. Bryant's and Bogost's version may differ on this. What is a sensual object? A sensual object is an appearance for another object. The table for my pencil is a sensual object. The table for my eyes is a sensual object. The table for my dinner is a sensual object. Sensual objects are wonderfully, disturbingly entangled in one another. This is where causality happens for object-oriented ontology, not in some mechanical basement. This is where the magical illusion of appearance happens. A mirror's a house for reflections. Yes, the mesh, the interrelatedness of everything, is a sensual object. Strange strangers are the real objects. Some very important entities that environmentalism thinks of as real, such as nature, are also sensual objects in my book. That is, they appear as what they are for a certain experiencer or user or apprehender or whatever. They are manifestations of what Graham Harman calls the as structure. Here's the kicker. They are as structured even though they appear to be some kind of deep background to human events. This confusion of sensual and real, in the terms of A House is a House for Me, is like thinking that bread really is a house for jam, and jam alone, rather than simply an idea that occurs to me and perhaps to the jam when it finds itself slathered in there. Marmalade wants in on the bread? Too bad! Marmalade is an artificial, unnatural parasite. Peanut butter? Illegal alien. Only jam is natural, i.e., bread is only made for jam. See the problem with nature? In object-oriented ontology ease, reification is precisely the reduction of a real object to its sensual appearance for another object. If you want to be poetic about it, or maybe more than poetic, reification is the reduction of one entity to another's fantasy about it. Nature is a reification in this sense. That's why we need ecology without nature. Emergence is also a sensual object, and thus it's in danger of reifying, strangely enough, given its reputation as an unreified, flowy sort of a thing. This is despite its popularity as a replacement for terms such as nature. Emergence, I shall argue, is always emergence for. In this slight hostility to emergence, I differ from Manuel de Landa, from whom emergence is a criterion for realness, and perhaps therefore from Graham Harman, not sure, and I'm sure I haven't thought it all through, but this would be why I must in the end also reject the kind of holism that argues for emergent properties. Emergence, sway, the way the flower unfurls, seeming, upsurge of being, definitely not yet nature or structure. These are some of the terms Heidegger uses to characterize what he considers to be the primary notion of the ancient Greek philosophers. Physis. There is some kind of appearing to, some kind of emerging for going on here. Being isn't separated from seeming at the most fundamental stage of Heidegger's account, and so there is no reason why a poem can't be construed as a physical object in as rich a sense as you like. And this is where scholar Eileen Joy has been working quite recently. It's only counterintuitive if you think that entities come with two floors, some kind of basement mechanics and some kind of pretty living room on top. But for object-oriented ontology, Heidegger's terms for being are simply elaborations on the as structure. Whether you call it emergence or appearance, what we are talking about is a sensual object. Looking backwards, it appears as if postmodern art was weirdly predictive of the age of ecological emergency we have now decisively entered. My favourite example would be David Byrne and Brian Eno's song, The Overload, on Talking Heads' Remain in Light. In the song, a phrase, a terrible signal too weak to even recognise, could mean at least two things at once, giving rise to a disturbing image of horrifying weakness. The signal could either be a sign of some kind coming through some medium or other, or it could be the medium itself, experienced as a substance in its own right. This superimposition of background and foreground, giving rise to a disturbing of expected relationships between sound and noise and between sign and medium, is a common trait of environmental art that explores ecological awareness in form as well as in content. The creeping realization that global warming is real, running parallel to this kind of environmental art, is also the uncanny sensation of waking up inside an object. Climate is a massively distributed object that surrounds Earth and that includes the sun and greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere. Too weak to even recognize from a human point of view, it requires terabytes of RAM processing speed to model in real time. Global warming has real, devastating effects on all parts of Earth's surface. Humans no longer live in a world or in an environment, and certainly not in nature. Global warming spells the end of the world, not in an apocalypse, but in an abject living on, in the absence of a meaningful life world bounded by a distant horizon. We have realized that the world is actually a gigantic object in which we exist, like Russian dolls inside a larger Russian doll. With its uncanny shadows and densities, postmodern culture is far more predictive of our contemporary awareness that we exist inside an object than traditional environmentalist culture with its images of interconnected webs and holistic oneness. Research published recently in Psychological Science has correlated moral disgust with physical disgust. If you eat something disgusting, you can feel moral disgust, with the reaction rising in those with more conservative views. Since ecological politics has to do with coexisting with other life forms, even if they are threatening or disgusting, and since Kantian taste is about knowing how to appear disgusted at the right moment, Derrida's brilliant essay Economimesis explores that, and since the whole Kantian edifice, hence the problem of correlationism in which philosophy has been stuck for the last 200 years, namely the notion that meaningfulness is only correlated to the human meaning, that objects are only real insofar as they are accessed by humans and so on. This whole edifice operates through the aesthetic. Therefore, it seems highly important to me that we investigate this phenomenon. In the time of hyperobjects, humans have gone beyond good taste, even romantic sublime good taste, into an uncanny existence with other entities, the strange strangers. Art can only be an uneasy collaboration between humans and non-humans, not a purely human exploration of access to non-humans or the lack thereof. Yet art also becomes expressive of profound causal relationships between beings, since it has been discovered that the aesthetic is the very blood of causality. Philosophy again must draw its inspiration from art, after the moment at which, in a state of the purest refined cynicism, it seemed like a sick joke even to think that thought. Thank you very much.